Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder about the hidden dangers lurking on the internet, especially around election time? Well, a fascinating new study dives deep into just that, exploring how much we stumble onto untrustworthy websites. And if artificial intelligence is making it worse, get ready to find out what Americans were really seeing online during the 2024 presidential election. So the big story here is that with all this fancy new AI technology generating text and images, people are worried it's being used to spread fake news and bad information online during elections. This study wanted to see if that fear was actually happening in the real world during the 2024 US presidential election. They combined what people actually did on their computers and phones with survey answers to get a clear picture. Here is something really interesting. Right off the bat, fewer Americans overall visited untrustworthy websites in 2024 compared to the elections in 2020 and 2016. This continues a trend that started a few years back, so that's good news, right? It seems like we're getting better at avoiding these bad sites, or perhaps these sites are reaching fewer people overall. But here is the twist. While fewer people are visiting these sites, those who do visit them are going there more often. It's like a smaller group of people are really doubling down on these untrustworthy sites. They're not just popping in once they're visiting more frequently. This tells us that the problem hasn't disappeared, it's just become more concentrated among a specific set of users. Who are these people? Well, much like in past elections, older adults and Republicans were still more likely than average to end up on these untrustworthy websites. However, the study noted that the gaps between these groups and others actually got smaller. So while they still visited them more, the difference between them and younger people or Democrats wasn't as big as it used to be. Another interesting finding is about how people get to these sites. Social media platforms act like gateways or referrers, sending people to different websites, and in 2024 Twitter or X actually sent more people to untrustworthy websites compared to 2020. This is important because it suggests that changes on certain platforms might directly impact how much people are exposed to bad information. Now let's talk about the AI part. Did AI make things worse? Well, the study found that yes, more Americans did encounter AI-generated untrustworthy websites in 2024 compared to 2020. And this is a big but, these AI sites still made up a very small part of all the untrustworthy websites people visited, and interestingly, there weren't big differences in who saw these AI sites based on age or political party. So what does all this mean? It means that even though fewer people are visiting untrustworthy websites, overall the problem is still there, and it's evolving. Especially with AI, it's not just about the quantity of fake news anymore. It's about how AI can potentially make it more persuasive and personalized. The study emphasizes that we need smarter ways to help people stay safe online and build resilience against this kind of content as AI gets even better. Let's dig a bit deeper into what untrustworthy content actually is. The researchers define it as information that goes against what experts tell us is true. It's not just honest mistakes, it's information that we know is likely false or misleading. This kind of content is a big deal because it can pull people apart politically. It can mess with our health decisions, like with vaccines, and it can even make us lose trust in important things like our government and elections. And that's where generative AI comes in. Think of tools like ChatGPT or AI image generators. These programs can create convincing text and images super fast and on a huge scale. That's why experts are so worried AI could supercharge the spread of misinformation, making it harder to spot because it might look and sound more real. Before this study, many researchers relied on asking people directly, did you see fake news or not? But that has some problems. First, people sometimes forget, or they might not even realize they saw something untrustworthy. Second, their answers might not always line up perfectly with what they actually did online. That's why this study used a different approach. They used digital trace data. This means they had participants install special software on their computers and phones that secretly tracked the websites they visited. This gives a much more accurate picture of what people are actually seeing online without them having to remember or guess. The researchers looked at data from 3 different US presidential elections, 2016, 2020, and now 2024. They used the same methods each time, so they could directly compare how things changed over the years. So for the 2024 election study, they got web browsing logs from over 1,000 Americans, more than 6 million website visits. In total, this data was collected for about 4 weeks before the election. And 1 week after, they then compared this browsing data against lists of known untrustworthy websites and a special list of AI-generated untrustworthy websites. They had 2 main lists of bad websites. One was a general list of untrustworthy sites they updated from previous studies to make sure it included the latest bad actors. The second was a very specific list of AI-generated untrustworthy sites. These were sites where AI clearly made a lot of the content and it wasn't properly checked by humans. To understand who was visiting these sites, they also collected information from surveys about things like age, gender, education, and political views. Their main questions were pretty straightforward. First, how does 2024 compare to 2016 and 2020 in terms of visiting untrustworthy sites? And second, how much of the untrustworthy stuff people saw in 2024 was actually made by AI? Let's get to the results at the top level. 16.5% of Americans visited at least one untrustworthy website. This is a big drop from 2020 when it was over 26%, an even bigger drop from 2016, when almost 45% did so. Overall, fewer people are bumping into these sites. But like we mentioned earlier, the interesting part is that for the people who did visit these sites, they visited them much more often. On average, people who visited untrustworthy sites in 2024 went to them 46 times compared to only about 23 times in 2020. So the engagement is deeper among a smaller group. This could mean they're not just accidentally clicking on these sites anymore, they might be actively seeking them out. Looking at demographics, older adults, 24.8% of those aged 65 and older visited untrustworthy sites compared to 13.8% of those aged 18 to 29. So that older demographic still has a higher tendency to visit these sites. However, the study notes that when you account for other factors like political views, the statistical difference for age alone became less pronounced. The political divide is still very much present. Republicans, 27.2%, were much more likely to visit untrustworthy websites than Democrats. 8.3%, this gap is even larger when looking at candidates. Trump supporters were significantly more likely to visit these sites than Harris supporters. This pattern holds true for political ideology. Two people who identify as very conservative or conservative had the highest rates of exposure to untrustworthy websites. And it's been like this for the last 3 elections over time. The exposure has declined for liberal and moderate groups, but stayed high for conservative groups. Interestingly, some things that used to predict exposure didn't as much in 2024. For example, having a college education or being a non-white individual were predictors in past elections. But they weren't as strong in 2024. This suggests the landscape of who is exposed to misinformation is shifting. Remember how we talked about referrals? Well, referrals from Twitter X to untrustworthy websites did indeed increase, going from 0.8% in 2020 to 2.3% in 2024. This supports the idea that changes on platforms like X might be driving exposure, and it's interesting because they found Facebook's share of referrals actually dropped. Now, for the AI-specific question, 6.5% of Americans visited at least one AI-generated untrustworthy website in 2024. This is up from 2.6% in 2020, so more people are seeing AI-generated misinformation. But even though more people saw them, they still made up a smaller part of the total untrustworthy website visits compared to 2020. So while the number of people seeing them went up, the overall slice of the untrustworthy pie that AI made wasn't bigger. Another hypothesis was that AI-generated content might be more engaging, meaning people would spend longer on it, but the study found no difference in how long people spent on AI-generated untrustworthy sites versus non-AI untrustworthy sites. And importantly, when it came to AI-generated untrustworthy websites, the big age and partisan differences we saw with general untrustworthy sites weren't really there for AI content. It wasn't older people, or Republicans specifically, who were seeing more of it. This suggests AI might be spreading differently compared to traditional misinformation. So let's wrap up what this all means. The biggest takeaway is that overall exposure to untrustworthy websites is down, which is great. But the engagement among those who do visit these sites is more intense. A smaller group is visiting more often. This tells us the problem is becoming more concentrated. Older adults and conservatives are still more likely to be exposed, but even their rates are lower than before. The study also points out that factors like partisanship and political interest are becoming more important in predicting exposure than just age alone. The rise of Twitter X as a referrer is a big deal. They think it might be linked to changes in how the platform manages trust and safety. They cut down on some of the people who used to deal with bad content. So this shift is something to watch. AI-generated untrustworthy sites are growing in reach, but they're still a small piece of the overall untrustworthy content pie. The study stresses that even a small amount of AI disinformation can still have a big impact, especially if it's really convincing or targets specific groups. It's really interesting that exposure went down even with all the new AI capabilities. Most people actually thought it would go up. This could be because platforms are getting better at blocking bad sites, or maybe people are getting their news more through apps and feeds that the study couldn't track, or maybe AI is creating misinformation that's harder to track, like short-lived stuff in private chats. Even Even though exposure is down, we can't ignore the potential of AI. AI could create much more personalized and persuasive untrustworthy content in the future. So we need smart policies and good technology design watermarks for AI content media literacy training that teaches people to spot fake stuff. These are all important. The study also brings up a digital literacy paradox, where people who are better with technology sometimes seem more anti trustworthy stuff because they explore more, so just being tech savvy isn't enough. The study offers a few key contributions. First, by looking at 2016, 2020, and 2024, with the same methods, they gave us a really solid way to see how things have changed over time. You can trust these comparisons. Second, the study confirms that certain groups like older adults and conservatives are still more at risk for exposure. This helps us know where to focus efforts and resources, and it highlights how platforms like X play a role in pointing people to this kind of content. And third, it's one of the first really good looks at how much AI-generated untrustworthy content people are actually seeing in the real world. Now, no study is perfect. The researchers point out a few things. First, they classify websites as untrustworthy at the domain level, meaning the whole site is labeled bad. But sometimes good sites might have a few bad articles and vice versa, and AI misinformation could pop up on regular trustworthy sites without being caught by their method. Also, this tracking method doesn't see what happens inside apps. Think about scrolling through your social media feed or chatting in a messaging app. If you see bad stuff there without clicking a link, the study can't measure it. This is a big blind spot as more news is consumed this way. AI can create new websites really fast, and they might disappear before researchers, or fact checkers can even label them as untrustworthy. And finally, this study shows who saw what and where they saw it, but it doesn't tell us if seeing that stuff actually changed anyone's mind or how they voted, or if it made them trust things less. So what does this all mean for us personally? I find it fascinating that overall exposure is down, but engagement is up. It feels like a more divided landscape, where some people are really digging into this stuff, while others are largely avoiding it. The rise of AI is definitely something to watch. Even if it's not dominating everything yet, it highlights how crucial it is to be critical consumers of online information. Looking ahead, it will be super interesting to see how AI misinformation evolves. Will it become more sophisticated? Will platforms get better at fighting it? Or will it continue to be a small but potent part of the online space? As this study suggests, what are your thoughts? Do you feel you see more or less untrustworthy content online compared to a few years ago? Let me know in the comments below, and if you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to Rubin's Mind Lab for more dives into fascinating research like this. See you next time.